The sky above the hive world of Cadrivus cracked like old bone, not a metaphor, but a tangible rupture in the firmament. Pollution and industrial haze churned in layers of grey and brown, lit from within by the unholy red of the rift that tore open without warning. Before we descend into the chaos of this tale, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more legends and dark histories from the Warhammer 40k universe. From within the wound, a figure emerged, falling in slow motion, yet with clear direction, a creature of contrasting shadows and deep indigo. Raven's cloak caught the poisonous wind and splayed like the wings of her namesake, her form wrapped in the darkness she commanded. Her mind brushed against the ambient psychic noise of billions of souls in torment, her empathic senses registering fear, apathy, rage, and devotion all at once. She did not belong to this universe, yet the warp recognized her. Energy washed over her from the tear, voices like old prayers and new curses whispering in tongues both ancient and ever new. For an instant she felt the shadow of her father Trigon, the ever-present demonic influence that had shaped her life, laughing at the familiarity of corruption. Raven closed her eyes and centered herself, repeating in her mind the mantra taught by her mother's people, the Azarathian chant of control. The darkness within her flared, not with anger, but with purpose, and her soul self extended in translucent waves to shield her descent. The warp's red light painted her grey skin a deeper tone as she pierced the smog and the smouldering tear sealed behind her. With a sigh that resonated across dimensions, the hive city sprawled in vertical layers, spires of rusted steel and rockcrete rising from fetid slums into clouds of toxic gas. Cadrivus was but one of the Imperium's countless industrial worlds, a place where humans were fuel for machines, and faith in the Emperor was hammered into them as surely as rivets into girders. Raven's eyes narrowed as she saw laborers moving like ants on a monstrous carcass, their faces lit by flickering hololiths bearing the imperial aquila. She also sensed something else, a current of wrongness that twisted through the warp like a vein of poison. Demonic energies bubbled beneath the surface, concentrated in pockets where rituals burned and blood spilled. She descended toward the largest of these disturbances, drawn by the promise of a portal similar to those she had destroyed in her own dimension. The closer she came, the more the physical environment asserted itself. Corrosion clung to every surface, from the fractured hab blocks to the skeletal frames of transport elevators. Smokestacks belched black clouds that stank of promethium and chemical waste. Raven's cloak billowed as she landed lightly on a platform overlooking a labyrinthine industrial district. The metal beneath her boots trembled from the vibration of distant machinery and the distant impact of artillery. Sirens wailed intermittently, a low keening that blended with the constant murmur of human voices and the occasional gunfire. Her arrival had gone unnoticed by most, yet she knew eyes would find her soon. In a realm where anything not sanctioned by the Imperium was considered heresy, an empathic sorceress descending from a tear in the sky would not be welcomed with open arms. Still, she had a mission. She extended her senses outward, tasting the psychic signatures of those nearby. Fear and desperation pervaded, but there was also conviction, the kind that comes from fanatic belief. Somewhere below, men and women were offering supplication to something that was not the God Emperor. Raven felt the hunger of warp entities feeding on that faith, growing stronger. Her path lay downward into the maze of corridors and shadows. Without a word, she drew the folds of her cloak close around her, becoming a silhouette among the complex's twisted geometry. Her boots made no sound on the catwalk as she moved, with calm certainty, toward the source of the disturbance. The emotional weight of the world pressed on her shoulders, but she carried it with the practiced grace of one who has balanced darkness and compassion for a lifetime. The section ended as she faded into the gloom, leaving the thrum of machinery and the weight of billions of souls above and below, a soft transition that underscored the epic scale of what lay ahead. Raven's path took her along suspended walkways that crisscrossed the underhive like veins in diseased flesh. The constant vibration of distant machines traveled through the metal into her bones, a reminder that this place lived and breathed in its own grim fashion. As she navigated the maze, she became aware of eyes upon her, not the simple curiosity of workers, but the practiced observation of someone trained to monitor and judge. On a raised platform to her right, a figure clad in dark carapace armor and bearing the winged skull icon of the Adeptus Arbites watched through a pair of magnoculars. His face was obscured by a rebreather mask, yet his posture radiated tension. Even at this distance, Raven could sense the rigid devotion that held him upright, a life of enforcing the law of an empire built on millions of laws. He spoke into a vox bead, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd despite the ambient noise. There were no quotation marks to separate his words from the world. They blended with the hum of turbines and the hiss of steam. Raven caught fragments through the warp, references to unauthorized warp activity, requests for Mechanicus assessment, and warnings about cult uprisings in other districts. She felt the flare of his irritation as some unseen superior denied his plea, citing other emergencies. The hive world was in crisis, not because of her arrival, but because of something deeper. Cult activity had simmered to boiling, and the arbitrators were stretched thin. The man lowered his magnoculars and turned, as if considering whether to follow up on what he had seen. Raven waited, hidden behind a pillar, her breathing steady. The decision was not hers to force. She merely noted the human element in this colossal machine of war and faith. The presence of authority figures like this one reminded her of the differences between her home reality and this place. In her world, she had fought alongside heroes who defied authority when necessary, guided by compassion rather than edict. Here, law was an iron cage, its enforcers bound by orders from distant lords who might never set foot on this world. Raven understood that to survive, she had to avoid direct confrontation with the Arbites. They would not listen to explanations from an unknown psionic being, especially one that arrived through a warp tear. Her empathy told her the man would shoot first and ask questions only after receiving authorization. She slipped deeper into the shadows, her cloak darkening to match the metallic walls. Through her connection to the warp, she listened as the arbitrator argued with his control center. They ordered him back to his precinct, citing Inquisition involvement. The word carried weight even here. Raven recognized the emotional spike of fear and respect that accompanied it. The Inquisition moved above even the Arbites, a hidden hand of the Emperor that dealt with threats beyond the comprehension of ordinary citizens. If they had taken notice, her presence would soon be under scrutiny by those whose ruthlessness made the Arbites seem merciful. As Raven moved downward, the ambient psychic static increased. The smell of oil and rust thickened. Pipes dripped unknown fluids that hissed as they hit the hot surfaces below. People moved in clusters, heads down, clutching their meager belongings. A child glanced up at her, eyes widening as if seeing an angel or a demon. Raven met the gaze and projected calm, a gentle wave of reassurance that momentarily eased the fear she felt. The child's mother pulled her away quickly, muttering a prayer. Not to the Emperor, Raven realized, but to some other force. Her skin prickled. She wrapped the sense of the arbitrator, the watchers, and the watchers of watchers into a mental map. They were pieces on a board she needed to navigate. The environment became more oppressive as she descended. The air grew warmer and staler. Flickering lumen strips cast intermittent light that made the shadows seem alive. Ahead, the source of the warp disturbance pulsed like a heartbeat. Raven adjusted her pace with calm certainty, prepared to confront whatever lay within. The section closed on the edge of a turning. the weight of unseen law lingering behind her like a hand she had slipped free of, ready to fall upon her at any moment. The corridor narrowed into a chamber that had once been a maintenance bay. Rusted servitors lay dormant against the walls, their mechanical arms folded like sleeping limbs. The floor was slick with oil and something darker. The warp signature that had drawn Raven here pulsed from the far end, where a group of figures were gathered around makeshift altars built from scrap and bones. They wore tattered work coveralls, stained with fluids that were not mechanical. Runes carved into their skin glowed faintly, their edges angry and raw. The chant they uttered had no melody, just guttural syllables repeated with increasing fervor. Each word tugged at the warp, forming a thin filament of connection to something hungry. Raven watched for a heartbeat, analyzing. The cultists did not yet see her. They were focused on the sickly orb of light hovering above the central altar. It was a nascent portal, a hole not yet fully open, its edges quivering as if reluctant to allow whatever was on the other side through. The air near it felt cooler, and the moisture from the tunnel walls coalesced and dripped in slow motion. She sensed creatures waiting beyond the threshold, claws scratching metaphorical stone, eager to tear into the material universe. She stepped forward. The edge of her cloak brushed against a dangling chain, and the soft metallic clink broke the rhythm of the cultists' chant. Heads snapped toward her as one. Eyes, some human and some no longer so, widened. One man with a mechanized jaw hissed. There were no words of greeting or challenge that needed punctuation. The emotion was enough. Their fear was immediate and intense, but it gave way quickly to fanatic devotion. They saw her as a threat to their ritual and a gift to their god. Several lunged, wielding repurposed tools sharpened into crude blades. Others swung heavy wrenches like clubs. The speed of their reaction suggested training or something deeper guiding them. Raven raised her arms, palms upward. Dark energy pooled around her fingertips, swirling into a translucent form that extended from her body like wings. The soul self manifested as a giant raven-shaped aura that enveloped the chamber, its eyes burning with purple light. It moved through her, yet it was her, an extension of mind and emotion. When the first cultist reached her, weapon raised, the soul self swept forward, passing through his body. He convulsed as the darkness washed through him, purging the warp influence that clung to his soul. It hurt him to be freed, a purging that left him sobbing and gasping on the floor. Another cultist stabbed at her, the blade passing through the immaterial darkness and striking only air as she shifted her physical body aside with practiced ease. She did not relish violence, but she had trained alongside warriors who understood that sometimes destruction was the only way to prevent greater suffering. In this chamber, mercy meant stopping the ritual. Her dark tendrils lashed out, encircling the orb of light. It resisted, flaring brighter, the whispers from beyond intensifying. Raven focused, drawing on her empathy not to feel the fear of the cultists, but to sense the fear of the creatures on the other side. They recognized her power as something that could close the door. They pressed harder. The portal bulged, threatening to rupture. She bent her will, channeling the energy of her soul self into the orb. There was a sound like wind being sucked through a narrow tube. The orb imploded, contracting into a pinpoint and then vanishing. The connection severed, the demonic presence receded, leaving only the mundane horror of the cult chamber. The cultists fell silent. Those who survived stared at her with hollow eyes, free for a moment from the warp's thrall. Somewhere behind them a pipe burst, releasing a jet of scalding steam that filled the air with a hiss. Raven lowered her arms, her breathing measured. She looked at each of the surviving cultists, seeing not enemies, but victims of a universe that cared little for individual lives. She could not save them all. Her mission was to stop the incursion. As if on cue, sirens blared somewhere above, and booted feet clanged on the catwalks. The arbitrators had been alerted. Raven turned and slipped back into the corridor, her soul self dissolving into the folds of her cloak. She left the cultists to face the consequences of their actions under Imperial law, her heart heavy but her resolve unshaken. The section closed with the fading echo of her footsteps, a soft note of regret carrying forward into the next movement of her journey. As Raven moved away from the ritual chamber, the echo of boots and the metallic clatter of armor grew closer. She kept to the shadows, pressing herself into a recess between rusted pipes, while a squad of Arbites thundered past. Their carapace armor gleamed in the dim light, and their visors were opaque mirrors that reflected nothing but menace. Behind them marched figures in hooded robes with bronze cog icons dangling from their belts, members of the Mechanicus whose vox emitters crackled with binaric prayer. They scanned for warp residue with Auspex devices, their lenses glowing red as they took readings. Raven held her breath, not because they could see her, but because she felt the weight of something greater moving behind these minor officials. Through the warp, she sensed a mind like a dagger, sharp and precise, slicing through the psychic noise with the assurance of someone who believed in their own righteousness. Absolutely. Inquisitorial thought patterns were distinct, she had learned from ancient texts on her Earth. They were cold, logical, and wrapped in zeal. The Inquisitor on Cadrivus was not physically present in the corridor, yet his orders flowed like ice water down the chain of command. Raven heard his voice transmitted through vox channels, a calm monotone issuing directives and judgments without hesitation. He referenced designations for containment, authorized lethal force against warp manifestations, and ordered the cross-referencing of unknown psychic signatures against known heretical entities. Every syllable carried authority. Raven understood the gravity of being noticed by an Inquisitor. In her own universe, she had faced persecution as a half-demon. Here, the Inquisition hunted not just demons, but anything that deviated from their narrow definition of humanity. She recalled reading about the Ordo Malleus and Ordo Hereticus, organizations that would view her lineage as an abomination. She could not allow them to categorize her before she closed the incursion. The risk of exterminatus loomed. She had seen glimpses of such actions in captured images, orbital bombardments that turned continents to slag to prevent the spread of chaos, billions of lives snuffed out in the name of purity. She shivered, not from cold, but from the weight of that possibility. The voice on the Vox spoke of the Underhive, the growing cult uprising, and a primary target that moved with purpose between ritual sites. That target was her. They spoke of her as if she were an animal to be tracked, not realizing she could hear them. She allowed herself a small smile. Being underestimated could be useful. She shifted her focus, using her empathic abilities to trace the emotional currents around her. Fear flowed from the hive workers, rigid duty from the Arbites, curiosity from the tech priests, and sharp anticipation from a cluster of minds approaching from another direction. These minds were unlike the others, disciplined, ancient, and forged in the fires of genetic engineering. Astartes. Raven knew little of the Adeptus Astartes beyond what legends whispered. Superhuman soldiers built to fight the Emperor's wars, each a living weapon more than a man. She sensed their approach in the vibrations of the floor before she saw them, heavy armored boots striking metal with rhythmic precision. Their psychic signatures were muted, shielded by war gear and training. She could not read them as easily, but she felt the cold resolve. They were coming for her. The Inquisitor had dispatched a kill team, not to aid her mission, but to classify and eliminate her if necessary. She realized she could not rely on stealth alone. The next steps required swiftness. Her hand touched the stone on her forehead that contained her soul gem, focusing her will. Shadows thickened around her form as she slipped into the spaces between moments, moving faster than human perception for a brief span. Time seemed to slow. She passed behind the Arbites and Mechanicus without them noticing, sliding past the first of the oncoming giants before they could react. The air around them smelled of ceramite and consecrated oils. She felt the brush of an Astartes gauntlet as she squeezed through a narrow gap, its surface inscribed with sigils of protection. On the other side of the corridor, she emerged into a service shaft that angled downward. She descended quickly, hearing the voices of those above raise in surprise as they realized she had evaded them. There was no satisfaction in outmaneuvering them, only the awareness that the window to act was closing. The Inquisition's gaze was fixed upon her. She had to act before their net tightened. She moved deeper into the hive, carrying with her the knowledge that powerful foes hunted her, and that the lives of the world above hung in balance. The section drifted to an end like the hum of the ship's engines, her resolve forged in the quiet determination that whatever else happened, she would not let another world fall to darkness. Down in the maintenance shafts the air grew warmer, thick with the scent of lubricants and ozone. Raven pressed her back against the cold rockcrete, listening. Above her, heavy footsteps echoed, measured and deliberate. The pattern was different from that of the Arbites, weightier, spaced farther apart, each step a testament to mass and power. Through a narrow grate she saw them pass, 5 towering figures clad in midnight black power armor, each marked with a silver pauldron emblazoned with a skull and crossbones motif. She knew these were Deathwatch, a specialized brotherhood drawn from different Space Marine chapters to fight Xenos and unnatural threats. The intensity of their presence pulsed in the warp like a heartbeat, strong and controlled. Raven observed them as they moved. The lead warrior carried a massive bolter cradled like a child's toy. His helmet bore a red stripe, and his posture spoke of command. Behind him walked a marine with bulky weapons slung across his back, his armor bristling with augmetic enhancements. His emotions were an oscillating pattern of machine logic and disciplined zeal. A third figure moved with an unusual grace, his steps almost silent for one so large, the emblem of a winged skull on his chest plate, hinting at a chapter known for stealth. The last two maintained rearguard, scanning their surroundings with sensors and psychic disciplines honed by decades of war. She sensed creatures waiting beyond the threshold, claws scratching metaphorical stone, eager to tear into the material universe. She stepped forward. The edge of her cloak brushed against a dangling chain, and the soft metallic clink broke the rhythm of the cultists' chant. Heads snapped toward her as one. Eyes, some human and some no longer so, widened. One man with a mechanized jaw hissed. There were no words of greeting or challenge that needed punctuation. The emotion was enough. Their fear was immediate and intense, but it gave way quickly to fanatic devotion. They saw her as a threat to their ritual and a gift to their god. Several lunged, wielding repurposed tools sharpened into crude blades. Others swung heavy wrenches like clubs. The speed of their reaction suggested training or something deeper guiding them. Raven raised her arms, palms upward. Dark energy pooled around her fingertips, swirling into a translucent form that extended from her body like wings. The soul's self manifested as a giant, raven-shaped aura that enveloped the chamber, its eyes burning with purple light. It moved through her, yet it was her, an extension of mind and emotion. When the first cultist reached her, weapon raised, the soul's self swept forward, passing through his body. He convulsed as the darkness washed through him, purging the warp influence that clung to his soul. It hurt him to be freed, a purging that left him sobbing and gasping on the floor. Another cultist stabbed at her, the blade passing through the immaterial darkness and striking only air as she shifted her physical body aside with practiced ease. She did not relish violence, but she had trained alongside warriors who understood that sometimes destruction was the only way to prevent greater suffering. In this chamber, mercy meant stopping the ritual. Her dark tendrils lashed out, encircling the orb of light. It resisted, flaring brighter, the whispers from beyond intensifying. Raven focused, drawing on her empathy not to feel the fear of the cultists, but to sense the fear of the creatures on the other side. They recognized her power as something that could close the door. They pressed harder. The portal bulged, threatening to rupture. She bent her will, channeling the energy of her soul self into the orb. There was a sound like wind being sucked through a narrow tube. The orb imploded, contracting into a pinpoint and then vanishing. The connection severed, the demonic presence receded, leaving only the mundane horror of the cult chamber. The cultists fell silent. Those who survived stared at her with hollow eyes, free for a moment from the warp's thrall. Somewhere behind them a pipe burst, releasing a jet of scalding steam that filled the air with a hiss. Raven lowered her arms, her breathing measured. She looked at each of the surviving cultists, seeing not enemies, but victims of a universe that cared little for individual lives. She could not save them all. Her mission was to stop the incursion. As if on cue, sirens blared somewhere above, and booted feet clanged on the catwalks. The arbitrators had been alerted. Raven turned and slipped back into the corridor, her soul self dissolving into the folds of her cloak. She left the cultists to face the consequences of their actions under Imperial law, her heart heavy, but her resolve unshaken. The section closed with the fading echo of her footsteps, a soft note of regret carrying forward into the next movement of her journey. As Raven moved away from the ritual chamber, the echo of boots and the metallic clatter of armor grew closer. She kept to the shadows, pressing herself into a recess between rusted pipes while a squad of Arbites thundered past. Their carapace armor gleamed in the dim light, and their visors were opaque mirrors that reflected nothing but menace. Behind them marched figures in hooded robes with bronze cog icons dangling from their belts, members of the Mechanicus whose vox emitters crackled with binaric prayer. They scanned for warp residue with Auspex devices, their lenses glowing red as they took readings. Raven held her breath, not because they could see her, but because she felt the weight of something greater moving behind these minor officials. Through the warp, she sensed a mind like a dagger, sharp and precise, slicing through the psychic noise with the assurance of someone who believed in their own righteousness. Absolutely. Inquisitorial thought patterns were distinct. She had learned from ancient texts on her Earth. They were cold, logical, and wrapped in zeal. The Inquisitor on Cadrivus was not physically present in the corridor, yet his orders flowed like ice water down the chain of command. Raven heard his voice transmitted through vox channels, a calm, monotone issuing directives and judgments without hesitation. He referenced designations for containment, authorized lethal force against warp manifestations, and ordered the cross-referencing of unknown psychic signatures against known heretical entities. Every syllable carried authority. Raven understood the gravity of being noticed by an Inquisitor. In her own universe she had faced persecution as a half-demon. Here the Inquisition hunted not just demons, but anything that deviated from their narrow definition of humanity. She recalled reading about the Ordo Malleus and Ordo Hereticus organizations that would view her lineage as an abomination. She could not allow them to categorize her before she closed the incursion. The risk of exterminatus loomed. She had seen glimpses of such actions in captured images, orbital bombardments that turned continents to slag to prevent the spread of chaos. Billions of lives snuffed out in the name of purity. She shivered, not from cold, but from the weight of that possibility. The voice on the Vox spoke of the underhive, the growing cult uprising, and a primary target that moved with purpose between ritual sites. That target was her. They spoke of her as if she were an animal to be tracked, not realizing she could hear them. She allowed herself a small smile. Being underestimated could be useful. She shifted her focus, using her empathic abilities to trace the emotional currents around her. Fear flowed from the hive workers, rigid duty from the Arbites, curiosity from the tech priests, and sharp anticipation from a cluster of minds approaching from another direction. These minds were unlike the others, disciplined, ancient, and forged in the fires of genetic engineering. Astartes. Raven knew little of the Adeptus Astartes beyond what legends whispered. Superhuman soldiers built to fight the Emperor's wars, each a living weapon more than a man. She sensed their approach in the vibrations of the floor before she saw them, heavy, armored boots striking metal with rhythmic precision. Their psychic signatures were muted, shielded by war gear and training. She could not read them as easily, but she felt the cold resolve. They were coming for her. The Inquisitor had dispatched a kill team, not to aid her mission, but to classify and eliminate her if necessary. She realized she could not rely on stealth alone. The next steps required swiftness. Her hand touched the stone on her forehead that contained her soul gem, focusing her will. Shadows thickened around her form as she slipped into the spaces between moments, moving faster than human perception for a brief span. Time seemed to slow. She passed behind the Arbites and Mechanicus without them noticing, sliding past the first of the oncoming giants before they could react. The air around them smelled of ceramite and consecrated oils. She felt the brush of an Astartes gauntlet as she squeezed through a narrow gap, its surface inscribed with sigils of protection. On the other side of the corridor she emerged into a service shaft that angled downward. She descended quickly, hearing the voices of those above raise in surprise as they realized she had evaded them. There was no satisfaction in outmaneuvering them, only the awareness that the window to act was closing. The Inquisition's gaze was fixed upon her. She had to act before their net tightened. She moved deeper into the hive, carrying with her the knowledge that powerful foes hunted her and that the lives of the world above hung in balance. The section drifted to an end like the hum of the ship's engines, her resolve forged in the quiet determination that whatever else happened, she would not let another world fall to darkness. Down in the maintenance shafts, the air grew warmer, thick with the scent of lubricants and ozone. Raven pressed her back against the cold rockcrete, listening. Above her, heavy footsteps echoed, measured and deliberate. The pattern was different. From that of the Arbites, weightier, spaced farther apart, each step a testament to mass and power. Through a narrow grate she saw them pass, 5 towering figures clad in midnight black power armor, each marked with a silver pauldron emblazoned with a skull and crossbones motif. She knew these were Deathwatch, a specialized brotherhood drawn from different Space Marine chapters to fight Xenos and unnatural threats. The intensity of their presence pulsed in the warp like a heartbeat, strong and controlled. Raven observed them as they moved. The lead warrior carried a massive bolter cradled like a child's toy. His helmet bore a red stripe, and his posture spoke of command. Behind him walked a Marine with bulky weapons slung across his back, his armor bristling with augmetic enhancements. His emotions were an oscillating pattern of machine logic and disciplined zeal. A third figure moved with an unusual grace, his steps almost silent for one so large, the emblem of a winged skull on his chest plate, hinting at a chapter known for stealth. The last two maintained rearguard, scanning their surroundings with sensors and psychic disciplines honed by decades of war. Their voices were muted behind their helms, transmitted through internal Vox links. Raven caught fragments, enemy signature detected, warp anomalies ahead, orders to capture if possible. She felt their mixed emotions, the ironclad obedience to the Inquisition's commands, and the undercurrent of curiosity regarding the unknown foe. These men had seen demons, Xeno's horrors, and the worst the galaxy had to offer, yet they still felt the sting of uncertainty. She knew they could not be easily overcome. Confrontation with them would be costly, and more importantly, would slow her mission. Her empathy sought points of common ground. These warriors fought to protect humanity as she did, albeit through different means. Her father's influence whispered that they were obstacles to be removed, but she drowned that voice with the memory of what her Azarathian masters taught her. There is always another path. She watched as they took up positions, one scanning the corridor with an auspex, another murmuring prayers to the machine spirits as he adjusted a heavy weapon. They were preparing to move into the area where she had destroyed the first ritual site. They would see the bodies, the closed portal, and they would make judgments. Raven realized she needed to lead them away from the remaining shrines. She drew in a slow breath, feeling the cold weight of the soul gem on her forehead. With practiced focus, she projected a psychic echo of her presence down a distant corridor. It was a faint shadow of her mind, enough to register on their senses as a warp anomaly. She felt them react instantly. The leader issued orders. The team shifted formation like a well-oiled machine and began to pursue the phantom. It would not hold them long, but it would buy her a few precious minutes. Moving quickly but silently, she slipped from her hiding place and continued along the shaft. The hum of power conduits filled her ears. She could still sense the Astartes behind her, but the distance grew. The heavy footfalls faded. Her misdirection had worked for now. She descended another level, and the psychic pressure increased. The second shrine was near, its energies rising like hot air. She paused briefly to center herself, letting the residual impressions of the Death Watch fade into the background. Their presence was a constant threat, but she could not focus on them. There were more important enemies to face. In the dim light, she ran her fingers along the corroded walls, feeling the vibrations of the hive, the thrum of ancient machines, and the pulse of something wrong. She reached a junction and chose the path that felt coldest in her mind. As she stepped into the darkness, the sounds of the Astartes faded, replaced by the whispering of cultists and the low murmur of another ritual beginning. She exhaled slowly, aware that the Emperor's finest were close behind, their intentions unknown, their presence both a promise of potential aid and a threat of lethal confrontation. The section drifted like smoke, a moment suspended between pursuing footsteps and the deeper call of the warp. The underhive unfolded before Raven as a labyrinth born of industry and neglect. Massive pipes lined the corridors like ribs of some long-dead beast, dripping cold condensation onto the detritus below. The walls were covered in graffiti, symbols of loyalty to the Emperor, crude depictions of demons, and gang markings carved into the grime. Fires burned in 50-gallon drums, casting orange light that flickered over gaunt faces. People huddled around the flames, their clothing a patchwork of rags and salvage. They spoke in hushed tones, watching the passageways with wide eyes. Every sound seemed amplified by the confined space, the distant clatter of machinery, the hiss of steam, the murmurs of fearful conversations. Raven walked among them, cloaked and silent. She felt the weight of their despair pressing on her mind. Each person carried grief and longing, sometimes simmering hatred, sometimes resigned acceptance. She allowed herself to feel it without being overwhelmed, channeling the emotions into a reserve of compassion. A woman with a child approached her, hand outstretched. Raven placed a gloved hand on the woman's head for a moment, projecting calm. The woman blinked as if waking from a nightmare. It was a small kindness in a sea of suffering. She continued through the labyrinth, senses attuned to the warp. In one alcove she found a man sitting alone, his back against a pile of scrap metal. His skin was pallid, and his eyes were milky white. He did not see her, yet he spoke, reciting verses that sounded like a corrupted litany. Raven listened. The words had once praised the Emperor, but had been twisted, the cadence broken. The man was a psyker, untrained and afraid, his power flickering around him like a candle struggling in the wind. She felt the warp tug at him, a predator circling. She knelt beside him, her presence causing the air to still. Without words, she reached out and drew the stray warp energies into her own aura, shielding him. His head lifted slightly and a trace of color returned to his cheeks. He continued to recite, but the corruption in his voice lessened. She could not save him entirely. He would need training and guidance he was unlikely to receive. But she had given him a moment of respite. Deeper still, the architecture changed. Massive reinforcement beams crisscrossed the corridors. Great holes in the floor led down into darkness, and improvised bridges of planks and cables spanned the gaps. The smell of rot grew stronger. Mutation was evident in the inhabitants here. A child with a second arm sprouting from his shoulder peered at her with mismatched eyes, curiosity overriding fear. A tall man leaned against a wall, his skin mottled green, horns budding from his brow. Raven sensed the taint of Nurgle, a plague god of pestilence and decay, lurking like mold. The warp energies were thick, sticky, and foul. She avoided direct contact, focusing on keeping her own aura pure. In one chamber, she paused. The walls were covered with crude drawings, skulls, knives, a silhouette of a raven with bleeding wings. She touched the drawing and felt a residual psychic imprint. Someone had dreamt of her before she arrived. The warp is timeless, she reminded herself. Visions travel across realities. She recognized the faint signature of her father's influence here, a mocking amusement that had painted her image among these hives as if to taunt her. She straightened, refusing to rise to the provocation. A sound reached her then, a rhythmic thumping accompanied by a deep growl. She turned a corner and found herself facing a group of ogrins, abhumans, massive and strong, each bearing imperial insignia burned into their flesh. They looked at her with small eyes in large faces, expressions blank but bodies tensed. Behind them, a commissar barked orders. Raven felt his mind like a sharp spike of authority. He did not hesitate, raising his bolt pistol. His intention was clear: eliminate the unknown. She let the darkness of her cloak envelop her, stepping back into the shadows. The commissar fired, but the bolt round passed through empty space. She moved through a gap between pipes, leaving the ogrins to follow orders and the commissar to curse what he believed to be a spectre. As she navigated away, she felt the warp grow thicker. The shrine was close. Mutated humans and wild creatures became more numerous. Rats the size of dogs scurried along ledges. Winged insects with razor claws fluttered about, trailing luminescent spores. The air vibrated with a frequency that was not sound but psychic resonance. Raven steadied herself, drawing on the calm she had cultivated in Azarath. Each step forward was a descent into deeper corruption, but it was also a step toward the heart of the problem. The section ended on the threshold of a chamber where unnatural light seeped through the cracks, promising a confrontation as inevitable as sunrise. The chamber she entered was cavernous compared to the narrow corridors. It had likely been a storage bay or reactor room before the cult claimed it. Now it was transformed into a grotesque temple. Pipes along the walls had been bent into circular patterns, forming makeshift sigils that glowed faintly in shades of crimson and sickly green. Chains hung from the ceiling, suspending bodies over an altar of steel plates riveted together. The bodies belonged to workers and gangers alike, their throats slit, their blood collected in bowls that overflowed onto the floor. The stench was nauseating. It mingled with the metallic tang of old machine oil and the sharp, sweet smell of warp energy. At the center of the room, a circle of symbols had been carved into the metal, deep grooves filled with blood that pulsed like a living heart. Within the circle hovered a portal larger than the one she had destroyed earlier. It swirled with an oily light that shifted between shades of red, brown, and black. The edges were jagged, giving the impression of torn flesh. Through it, shapes moved, claws, horns, countless eyes. The barrier between realities was thin here. The chanting that accompanied the ritual came from robed figures kneeling around the circle. Their voices were low and rhythmic, their faces hidden. The words were not human tongues, but invocations of chaos. Raven stepped forward, unafraid, but cautious. The temperature in the room fluctuated, causing her breath to fog, even in the underhive's warmth. Her soul self manifested behind her, its spectral wings spread. She could feel the portal pulling at her, trying to draw her power into the warp. She braced herself, channeling Azarathian discipline. Her focus narrowed to the portal, to the pattern of the symbols inscribed around it. Demonic energies flowed along those symbols like electricity through wires. Break the pattern, and the power would dissipate. Before she could act, something emerged from the portal. At first it was only a hand, huge and gnarled, claws dripping with ichor. Then a head, horned and covered in bronze plates, followed by a torso bulging with muscle. A demon of corn forced its way through the tear, roaring silently in a voice that vibrated her bones. It looked like a monstrous amalgamation of bull and man, but its eyes burned with cunning rather than animal rage. When it saw her, its lips pulled back in a grimace. It recognized her as a threat and a prize. Raven extended a tendril of dark energy, striking at the demon's claw as it pulled itself free. The force snapped one of the clawed fingers, ichor spraying. The demon snarled, pushing harder against the portal's resistance. With calm certainty, she began to unravel the sigils around the circle. Her shadow energy flowed across the grooves, altering the pattern. The cultists noticed her then, their chant faltering. One lunged at her with a chain blade, but she sidestepped, letting him fall past her. She did not kill him. His fate would be sealed by others. Her focus remained on the ritual. The daemon pulled its upper body through, its hooves scraping against the metal. It swung at her with its good hand, claws raking through the air. She ducked, feeling the wind of its strike. The impact shredded a hanging chain behind her, sending a corpse tumbling to the floor. The sound echoed. The portal widened, its edges tearing further. Raven pushed more power into the sigil disruption. She felt the weave shift, the flow of warp energy stutter. The demon roared soundlessly again, its eyes widening as the portal began to shrink around it. It struggled, trying to force itself through, but the edges closed like a vice. With one final surge of energy, Raven severed the flow entirely. The portal collapsed, slicing through the daemon's body. The creature's upper half fell onto the floor, thrashing. Its lower half was severed and pulled back into the warp with a wet, sucking sound. Ichor steamed on the metal. The remaining cultists fled or fell to their knees, their minds broken by the failure of their ritual. Raven stood amidst the chaos, her breath coming in steady, measured beats. She looked at the half-demon, its eyes still burning. It glared at her, hate radiating. She met its gaze with calm, not cruelty, and allowed her soul self to wash over it. The creature dissolved into smoke, returning to the warp, wholly. She had prevented another incursion, but she knew there were more. The Inquisitor's kill team would soon see the results and draw their own conclusions. She turned away from the shattered altar. Her boots left prints in the blood. The chamber felt quieter, as if holding its breath after a storm. She moved toward the exit, aware that each success drew more attention. The walls seemed to lean closer as she passed, the hive itself listening. At the threshold, she paused, sensing the tension building behind her, like the pressure before a dam bursts. She stepped into the corridor, the horror of the shrine fading behind her like a dark echo, replaced by the persistent rumble of the hive and the knowledge that the greater battle lay ahead. The path toward the next disturbance took Raven into a cavernous hall where ancient locomotives once hauled ore to the upper hives. The rails were twisted and rusted, their power cables torn out and repurposed by gangs. Great piles of refuse and scrap metal created a maze of cover, and fires burned in oil drums, casting long, dancing shadows. The air crackled with warp energy. Raven could feel the pressure of another portal forming, but this one was not fully opened. Instead, she sensed a singular presence, immense and singular, pacing like a caged predator. He emerged from behind a mound of scrap, stepping into the open with a confidence born of brutality. He stood more than 2 meters tall, a bulk of corded muscle and brass-etched armor fused with his flesh. His eyes were pits of molten iron. His chain axe, embedded with teeth taken from demonic creatures, hummed with murderous anticipation. The symbol of Khorne, the blood god, was etched into his chest in raised scar tissue. This was no mere cultist, but a champion chosen by his deity. He looked at her and smiled, revealing sharpened teeth. Words spilled from him like molten metal. He spoke of prophecy and offerings, of the pleasure in tearing apart those who opposed his god. Raven listened without outward reaction. She would not dignify his madness with a response. Instead, she opened herself to his emotions. Beneath the bravado and bloodlust, she sensed a small, hard core of pain, a trauma exploited by the dark god to mold him. Once he might have been a loyal worker or soldier. Now he was a weapon. He charged, chain axe raised. Raven moved, her cloak flaring as she dodged the first swing. The weapon bit into the ground where she had been a moment before, sending sparks flying. The champion recovered quickly, swinging again and again, each blow accompanied by a guttural sound that was half curse, half prayer. Raven evaded, her movements fluid. She did not attempt to match his brute force. Instead, she used his momentum against him. She created shadow constructs that he shattered, each impact slowing him fractionally. As he tired, she grew sharper. She reached out with her soul self, letting tendrils of darkness snake around his limbs. He flexed, straining, muscles bulging. The chain axe roared as he twisted, tearing free from her grip. He lunged again, the blade passing perilously close to her face. A few strands of her hair were caught and shredded, floating away like black silk. She could smell the oil and blood that coated the weapon. She saw in his mind the countless victims it had torn apart. Anger stirred in her, but she channeled it into focus. With a deft motion, she sent a wave of empathic energy toward him. It was not a blast of force, but a surge of feeling, a reflection of the pain he had caused. He staggered, momentarily confused as memories of his own suffering surfaced. She followed with a physical strike, her gloved fist connecting with his chin. He reeled back, more surprised than hurt. He shook his head, snarled, and came at her again, this time switching tactics. Instead of swinging wide, he jabbed forward, using the axe head like a spear. She sidestepped, caught the haft with a ribbon of dark energy, and yanked. The weapon twisted in his grasp. He held on, refusing to relinquish his symbol of power. Realizing he would not drop it willingly, she changed strategy. She stepped inside his reach, closing the distance to where the chain axe was unwieldy. He tried to knee her, but she blocked with her forearm, absorbing the force. She looked up into his eyes. For a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. She projected a vision into his mind, his life before the cult, his family, his hopes. He balked, stunned by the sudden empathy. His grip loosened. She seized the chain axe handle and pushed. The weapon went up, the teeth spinning, harmlessly shredding a spray of sparks above their heads. With her other hand, she drew dark energy and pressed it against his chest. The symbol of Khorne burned briefly as her power met the warp brand. There was a hiss and a flash. The champion screamed silently, his throat unable to carry the sound. He fell backward, his chain axe slipping from his grasp. Raven stood over him, breathing deeply. She watched as his body convulsed, the warp energies leaving him like smoke. She did not take joy in his death, but she felt relief that his victims would no longer suffer. She placed a hand on his forehead, closing his eyes. Even a monster deserved an end. She whispered a silent promise to herself. She would not allow his fate to be in vain. She turned away as the fires flickered, leaving his form amidst the scrap. The portal he had guarded flickered and died, the energies dissipating as if recognizing their guardian's fall. The section ended with the echo of the champion's last breath mixing with the constant background noise of machinery, a soft exhale marking another small victory in a war that spanned realities. Raven sensed the Death Watch before she saw them. The warp carried their intent like heat off a forge. Discipline, suspicion, righteous fury. They moved down the tunnel she had just left, their formation tight, bolters raised. Their armor gleamed even in the underhive's gloom, polished black with silver trim that caught the flickering light. The lead Astartes lifted his hand, signaling his brothers to halt. His helm turned towards the remains of the shrine and the fallen champion. She saw his posture shift, a slight tightening as he took in the scene. She stepped out from behind a column of pipes, choosing to reveal herself rather than be discovered by surprise. The reaction was immediate. Bolters leveled, finger triggers tightened. Raven raised her hands, slowly, palms open. She offered no words. There was no common tongue between them for negotiation without quotes. She projected calm through the warp, hoping they would feel her intention. The lead Space Marine's voice boomed through his external vox, his words formal and devoid of emotion. He declared her an unknown Xenos or warp entity. He commanded her to stand down in the name of the Emperor. She remained still. Her eyes met his visor, seeing her reflection, a woman cloaked in darkness, her face framed by a hood, a gem glowing on her forehead. She could read nothing from his expression, but she sensed his internal conflict. He had orders to neutralize her, but he had also seen the demons she had killed. In that split second of hesitation, one of his brothers acted. A heavy bolter fired. The sound thundered down the tunnel, a staccato of mass-reactive shells. Raven reacted instinctively. Shadows wrapped around her, forming a barrier. The bolts hit the darkness and exploded, sending shockwaves that rattled her bones. She staggered, forced back by the sheer kinetic force. Her barrier held, but only barely. She could not withstand a prolonged barrage. She darted to the side, using the uneven terrain as cover. The second Astartes with a flamer advanced, flames spewing from the muzzle in a gout of promethium. Heat scorched the air. Her cloak caught fire at the edges, but she smothered the flames with her soul self, then retaliated with a pulse of dark energy that extinguished the promethium and sent the flamer wielder stumbling. She knew she could not overpower them. Their armor and resilience were beyond human. She needed to dissuade them without killing them. She focused on the emotions emanating from the lead Space Marine. Through the warp, she whispered to him feelings of the countless lives she had saved, the pain of the worlds she had failed, the weight of responsibility that drove her. was not mind control but a sharing of perspective. She felt his internal walls resist, but the message sank in enough to cause doubt. "Brother Captain," one of the Marines intoned, "this entity destroyed the cult shrine." Another argued that its powers were tainted. The lead Astartes held up his hand again. Silence fell. Raven could feel the tension like a drawn bow. He spoke words of caution and duty. He commanded her again to explain her purpose. She could not speak in their language, but she lowered her hands and placed one over her heart. She projected images into their minds, the portal closing, the demon cut in half, the champion laid to rest. She let them feel her revulsion at the corruption and her commitment to stopping it. The captain hesitated. Then, ever so slightly, he lowered his bolter. The others followed. The moment of violence suspended on a knife edge eased. He gestured for her to step aside. She did, moving with deliberate slowness, her cloak brushing the tunnel wall. They watched her like predators watching an unknown beast. When she was clear, they advanced toward the shrine to investigate. As they passed, one of them glanced at her, curiosity flickering behind the helm. She held his gaze for a brief heartbeat, then turned away. She left them to their orders. She would not be captured. There were more shrines to close, more lives to save. She moved swiftly down a side tunnel, her footsteps echoing softly. Behind her, the voices of the Death Watch resumed, analyzing the scene, reporting to their superiors. Their presence weighed on her like a physical pressure, but she carried on. She chose to see them as allies she could not yet approach, rather than as enemies. The section ended with her silhouette merging with the shadows, the sound of bolter shells being ejected and the faint, murmured litanies of the space. Marines lingering like a distant drumbeat. The path from the confrontation with the Death Watch led Raven into an area of the Underhive that bore the scars of recent battle. Burnt-out Hab units stood like hollow teeth, their interiors blackened and skeletal. The smell of last burned flesh lingered. In one corner, a group of survivors huddled around a makeshift shrine to the Emperor, its icon stained with soot. Their prayers were frantic, voices high-pitched with desperation. Raven paused, feeling the edge of their fear. For them, salvation was a distant concept. In the distance, the mournful moan of sirens echoed, each tone a reminder of the constant threat of disaster. Above, behind layers of steel and stone, Inquisitor Caradoc stood in a command post, staring at hololithic projections of the hive. Raven sensed his mind again, cold and sharp. He issued directives with the precision of a surgeon. He authorized targeted purges of suspected cult nests, the deployment of penal legionaries to floodblock tunnels, the consolidation of Arbites units around key infrastructure. He spoke of collateral damage without emotion. Lives lost were numbers on a data slate. The Emperor protects, he recited, but his protection was often delivered through destruction. She felt the weight of his authority pressing down like a storm cloud. A servo skull drifted down through a hatch, its mechanical eyes scanning. It hovered near her, its camera lens glowing. Raven stepped back into a shadow, blending into the wall. The skull paused as if puzzled, then continued on its patrol. Through it, she felt the Inquisitor's gaze. He saw through dozens of such devices, his vision multiplied. He had likely seen her already at one of the shrines, but he could not control her. His frustration was a hard line of pressure in the warp. He ordered his acolytes to identify her, to cross-reference her appearance with heretical texts. Raven moved again, leaving the servo skull behind. She reflected on the paradox of this reality. The Imperium fought chaos with a ferocity unmatched in her universe, yet in doing so, it had become something akin to the evil it resisted. Whole populations were expendable. Knowledge was suppressed. Psychic potential was feared and chained. She thought of the titans she had known, Superman, Wonder Woman, Cyborg, and how they fought to inspire and protect. Here, even heroes like the Astartes inspired fear as much as hope. She wondered if the Emperor had intended this outcome when he set out to unify humanity 10,000 years earlier. Her contemplations were interrupted by a sudden surge of warp energy. It washed over her like a wave, bringing with it images of pain, laughter, and the color red. Somewhere below, the cultists had accelerated their ritual. She quickened her pace, sliding down a rubble-strewn slope into another tunnel. The walls here were decorated with frescoes depicting scenes of war and victory. Imperial guardsmen were shown raising banners over alien corpses. In one mural, a giant armored warrior impaled a horned creature on his sword. Raven wondered if anyone in these tunnels understood the stories they painted, or if they were mere propaganda. As she navigated, she felt the Inquisitor's attention tighten on her once more. He had likely received reports from the Death Watch. He would soon make a decision. Either he would recall his forces to allow her to act, or he would order an extermination. She could not influence him directly. He was too far, too shielded by faith and duty. She could only act faster. She sensed the next ritual site's location, deeper, near the hive's reactor core, where heat and radiation made survival difficult. The cult chose such places because they were less likely to be monitored. She steeled herself. Before descending further, she paused outside a cracked vid display showing an Imperial propaganda reel. The voiceover extolled the sacrifices of the Emperor's servants, the need for purity and vigilance. Raven watched as images of soldiers charging into battle played alongside footage of heretic mutants being burned. She felt the weight of those images. It was easy to see how such messages kept populations in line. Fear, faith, and violence were interwoven. She touched the screen gently, her fingers leaving a faint smear on the dust. She turned away, the voices of the reel continuing behind her, muffled by distance. The section ended with her stepping into a service elevator shaft that plunged into darkness, leaving behind the echo of propaganda and carrying forward a blend of determination and somber understanding. The service elevator had long since ceased functioning. Its cables hung like cobweb strands, swaying gently in the air, currents that rose from the reactor levels below. Raven climbed down using maintenance ladders, her gloved hands gripping rungs slick with condensation. The air grew warmer with each meter of descent, and the odor changed from rust to ozone and burnt plastic. The hum of the reactors became a constant vibration in her chest, a low thrumming that threatened to merge with her heartbeat. Lights flickered or failed entirely, leaving sections in complete darkness. She relied on the faint luminescence of her soul gem and her other senses to navigate it. The bottom of the shaft, she emerged into a cavernous space filled with towering reactor casings and sprawling coolant pipes. Streams of coolant hissed from ruptured lines, creating pools of luminescent liquid on the floor. Steam hung in thick clouds. Shadows played across the metal surfaces, making the machinery seem alive. The temperature was oppressive, yet she welcomed it as a sign that she was close to the heart of the hive's power. She sensed warp energy interwoven with the electric fields, a corruption that sapped heat and fed on radiation. Creatures lurked among the reactors. They were not human cultists, but mutants born of exposure to radiation and warp taint. Their skin was translucent, their bones visible beneath as dark silhouettes. They moved on all fours, eyes glowing with eerie light. They hissed when they saw her, lips peeling back to reveal needle-like teeth. Their emotions were a confusing blend of hunger and fear. Raven raised her hand, projecting calm. The creatures recoiled, their heads tilting. She sensed that they were no threat unless provoked. She let them be, stepping around them as they retreated into the vents. The ritual site here was different. It was built around one of the reactor's coolant reservoirs. The cultists had drained part of the reservoir and filled it with a mixture of blood and coolant. The liquid glowed, casting a sickly pale light. A lattice of chains hung above it, supporting cages filled with writhing shapes. These were psykers captured from the lower hives, their eyes rolled back, their mouths gagged. Their psychic potential was being bled off into the ritual, their suffering used to punch a hole through reality. Raven's stomach tightened. She felt each mind like a flickering candle in a storm. If she acted too late, the portal would open fully. If she acted too rashly, the psykers could die from backlash. She approached, her soul's self coalescing behind her. The cult leader here was not a warrior but a sorcerer. His hands were elongated, fingers tipped with claws, and his eyes were black voids. His robe shimmered with runes that shifted position when she tried to focus on them. He was drawing warp energy through the psykers like water through a pump, channeling it into a vortex forming above the reservoir. He saw her and smiled. His mouth was filled with needle teeth, but his expression was almost gentle, as if welcoming an old friend. He spoke words that tasted like lies. He promised her power if she joined them, understanding if she surrendered. Raven felt a thread of temptation, the ever-present lure of her father's realm, but she cut it with disdain. With swift motion, she reached for the cages, her dark tendrils slicing through the chains. The psykers fell, dropping into the blood-coolant mixture. They splashed and sank, then bobbed to the surface, gasping. Free from the sorcerer's binding runes, their psychic energy flared uncontrolled. The vortex above shuddered. The sorcerer's smile vanished. He raised his hands, claws glowing. Raven conjured a barrier of shadows, deflecting his first blast of warp fire. The impact sent her sliding backward, feet skidding on the slick floor. Heat seared her cheeks. She pushed forward, her soul self engulfing the sorcerer. He screamed silently, thrashing as her darkness invaded his mind, revealing the humanity he had surrendered in exchange for power. He clawed at his own face, ripping away skin in an attempt to escape. He fell into the coolant mixture, his body dissolving in seconds. The vortex above the reservoir began to widen as the liberated psychic energy surged unpredictably. Raven reacted quickly, drawing the energy into her soul gem. It was like trying to pull electricity with bare hands. She grimaced, forcing the chaotic power through her own channels. For a moment she saw flashes, other worlds, other hives, her own team back on Earth. She heard Trigon's laugh and her mother's voice. She held firm. The vortex shrank under her control, spiraling inward until it collapsed with a sound like a clap of thunder muffled by blankets. The psykers in the reservoir moaned. She moved among them, pulling them to the edge and laying them on the metal grate. Their eyes fluttered open, hazy. She projected calm and exhaustion. They felt it and closed their eyes, sleeping. Her body trembled with exertion. The heat of the reactor seemed to fade as the warp energy dissipated. She wiped her brow with the back of her glove, smearing sweat. She had saved these psykers, but they would likely be killed or enslaved by the Imperium. It was a bitter thought. She lifted one to his feet, helping him stumble toward a safer corner. He looked at her with gratitude and confusion. She could not take them with her. She whispered a silent prayer for them, a prayer that they might find mercy in a universe short on it. She turned away, leaving them with heavy steps. The section ended with the hum of the reactors rising again, the temperature climbing, and Raven climbing a ladder back toward the main tunnels, carrying the weight of those she could not protect. At last, the twisting corridors and service shafts gave way to an enormous cavity carved from the living rock of the world itself. This was the heart of Cadrivus's hive, the location where the cultists sought to tear a hole in reality wide enough to summon something monumental. The space had once housed a primary processing plant, a place where ore was refined and distributed. Now it resembled a cathedral of metal and ruin. Massive pillars of girded steel rose to a ceiling lost in shadow. Catwalks and gantries crisscrossed the open space, forming a lattice like the veins of a colossal beast. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, iron, and blood. In the center of this vast space stood the cult's grand altar. It was a tower built from industrial machines, broken cogitator consoles, skulls and bones fused together with brass and blood. At its apex was a broad platform where a ritual circle had been etched deep into the metal. The lines of the circle glowed with a light that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Around it knelt hundreds of cultists, their bodies swaying in unison, their voices raised in a chant that resonated with the structure itself. On the platform stood the cult's high priest, a figure draped in red and gold, his face hidden behind a mask carved to resemble a snarling demon. Beside him floated a crystalline orb about the size of a man's head. Within it swirled a storm of red and black energy. Raven recognized it as an anchor point, a locus designed to focus the cumulative psychic output of the chanting cultists. That energy was being fed upward into a point above the platform where the air shimmered and twisted. Already she could see things moving within the shimmer, vast wings, horns, eyes like suns. This ritual, if completed, would unleash a greater demon of Khorne into the hive, a being of rage that would massacre every living thing in its path. Her presence was noted almost immediately. The chanting faltered. Hundreds of heads turned, eyes wide with fanaticism. The high priest raised his hands, his voice booming out, blending with the chant. He named her as a blasphemous intruder, a defiler of sacred rites. He promised his followers glory if they offered her blood to the blood god. The cultists surged as one, rising from their kneel. They came at her with axes, blades, and makeshift weapons, their fear replaced by frenzied devotion. Raven braced herself, her soul self unfurling like a cloak of night. She did not have the time to fight them all individually. She needed to strike at the ritual's core. She flung her darkness outward, not to kill, but to push. A wave of shadow swept over the first rank of cultists, lifting them off their feet and tossing them aside like leaves caught in a gale. They scrambled to rise, their chant turning into curses and shrieks. She leapt forward, landing on a lower catwalk that led toward the altar tower. Her boots clanged on the metal, the sound drowned by the roar of the cult. Arrows and stubber rounds whipped past her, some digging into her cloak. She ignored them. Her focus was the orb. If she shattered it, the ritual would collapse. The high priest reached into his robes and drew forth a blade that looked more like a shard of obsidian than steel. It pulsed with warp energy, every edge singing with the promise of bloodshed. He leapt down from the platform with an agility that belied his age and size. He landed between Raven and the tower, his mask reflecting her image. He raised the blade in salute, then lunged. Raven met him head-on. Their clash was silent save for the screech of their weapons' energies clashing. His blade met her dark tendrils, and sparks of crimson lightning arced. He was stronger than he looked, bolstered by the energy of the ritual. He pressed forward with relentless fury, pushing her toward the edge of the catwalk. She felt the metal vibrate, the chant behind him surging again. She shifted sideways, letting him overextend. She struck with a tendril of shadow aimed at the orb. He blocked, but it cost him his balance. She spun, bringing her foot around in a low sweep. It connected with his knee. He stumbled, his blade flailing. She seized the moment and sent a spear of shadow through his shoulder. He screamed, stumbling back. He raised his blade to strike again, but she stepped in close, pressing her palm to his chest. She sent a pulse of empathic force through him, not pain but sorrow, letting him feel the weight of every life his ritual would claim. He froze, the mask quivering. Behind it, his eyes filled with tears. For a heartbeat, his fanaticism wavered. She used that moment to push past him, sprinting toward the ladder that led up the tower. Cultists grabbed at her ankles, at her cloak. She kicked free, climbing. The high priest roared something incomprehensible and rallied his followers. They renewed their chant, pouring more power into the orb. The shimmer above the altar expanded, edges reddening. Raven reached the platform. The orb pulsed, its internal storms swirling faster. She extended her hand, calling to her soul self. Dark wings wrapped around the sphere. The orb resisted, its surface crackling. She squeezed. Her gem glowed. The storm inside the sphere fought to escape. With calm certainty, she pressed harder. The orb cracked, lines spiderwebbing across its surface. A shock wave burst outward, knocking her backward. She braced against the railing. The orb shattered, pieces dissolving into nothing before they touched the ground. The ritual circle dimmed. The shimmer above the platform quivered and began to fold in on itself. The shapes within screamed, the sound layered with dozens of voices that only she could hear. The high priest howled, charging up the ladder. He raised his blade. Raven sidestepped his swing, grabbed his wrist, and guided his momentum forward. He toppled over the railing, falling into the crowd below. He vanished beneath the throng. Without his guidance, the chant faltered entirely. The portal collapsed, sucking in stray energies with a roar. The cultists screamed as the backlash whipped through them, energy arcs burning out their nerves. Raven stood on the platform, hair blowing in the wind created by the collapsing vortex. She breathed deeply, tasting iron. She watched the light fade, felt the temperature drop as the warp retreated. She had stopped the summoning. The silence after the collapse was profound, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the distant rumble of the hive. She knew the Death Watch and the Inquisition were closing in. She would not remain. She turned, leaping from the platform to a nearby gantry. Her body rolled, absorbing the impact. She landed in a crouch and ran, disappearing into the network of catwalks. The section closed on the image of her black cloak vanishing into the shadows, leaving behind a broken ritual and a hive suspended between ruin and salvation. As Raven retreated from the destroyed altar, the quiet that settled around her was deceptive. It was not the calm after a completed task, but the pause before another wave of conflict. The warp energy she had wrestled into her gem seethed within her, pressing against her barriers like a caged animal. She felt heat behind her eyes. The jewel on her forehead pulsed in time with her heartbeat. This closeness to the warp, this repeated drawing and shaping of its essence, risked weakening the locks she had placed on the darkness within herself. She had been born of a demon and a human, and that bloodline granted her power, but also constant temptation. The corridors she navigated now were narrower, the walls pressing in. Lights flickered, casting her shadow at odd angles. As she moved, she heard whispers that were not from the cult or the Inquisition. They came from inside. They were the voices of her heritage, led by the deep, honeyed tone of Trigon. They coaxed and coaxed, praising her for using her power, suggesting she could do more if she embraced her full potential. They promised relief from the constant struggle of restraint. They mocked the Imperium's brutality, pointed out the hypocrisy of those who claimed to fight for humanity while sacrificing it wholesale. They invited her to reshape this reality into something better, if only she would let go. Raven's hand clenched. She stopped in a small alcove where an old shrine to the Emperor had been defaced. The Aquila symbol had been carved away, replaced by crude symbols that she could not fully read. She pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. In her mind, she pictured the calm waters of Azarath, the place where she had learned to master her emotions. She saw her mentors, Arella, Azar, teaching her that emotions were not enemies, but currents to navigate. She breathed in, counting slowly, letting the warp energies settle. She refused to answer Trigon's taunts. She remembered her friends from Earth, empathic Starfire's bright laughter, Robin's determination, Beast Boy's jokes, Cyborg's loyalty. Each memory was a thread anchoring her to herself. She recalled the times she had almost lost control in their presence, and how they had pulled her back with compassion. She drew strength from that. Here, far from them, she had to be her own anchor. She whispered, not aloud but inwardly, a mantra of self-control. Each word was a stone thrown into the turbulent waters inside her, calming the waves. The whispers faded to a low murmur. The pressure eased. She felt the warp energy in her gems subside, its heat becoming manageable. She lifted her head and opened her eyes. The defaced shrine looked different now. She saw beyond the gouged metal to the hope that had once been placed there. People had prayed here once, believing that someone watched over them. Their belief had been twisted, but the human longing for protection remained. She reached out and touched the broken Aquila. She did not worship the emperor, but she respected the faith that had built an empire, even one as flawed as this. She resumed her journey, footsteps light. As she moved, she kept one hand on the wall, feeling its solidity. She allowed herself to feel her emotions without drowning. There was sadness for the lives lost, anger at the cruelty of the cults and the Imperium, hope that she had made a difference, and determination to continue. Her father's voice still whispered, but it was a distant echo now. She would always carry him within her, but he would not control her. With calm certainty, she moved toward the final disturbance her senses detected, deeper into the labyrinth. The section ended on the sound of her breathing steadying, a quiet rhythm that contrasted with the chaos around her and served as a reminder that discipline and empathy were her greatest weapons. The labyrinth disgorged her into a large chamber just as heavy footfalls signaled the arrival of the death. Watch, the collapse of the grand ritual had accelerated their approach. They entered from multiple access points, forming a wide cordon. Their armor was marred now by battle, scratches, dents, the residue of ichor. Their eyes, hidden behind lenses, burned with a mix of fatigue and resolve. Brother Captain Thal, the name floated to her through their vox, raised a hand, and the squad halted in unison. He stepped forward, sword drawn, the blade crackling with disruptive energy. "We meet again," his tone conveyed through vox and posture rather than quoted speech. There was no malice, only duty. Raven felt a pulse of respect. He had watched her actions. He had seen the demons fall, yet he still saw her as unknown. Unknown was dangerous. He spoke of protocols, of containment, of the Inquisition's directives. Behind him, other Marines spread out, creating lanes of fire. Their heavy weapons tracked her movements. The ambient light reflected off their armor, making them appear like statues of judgment. Raven considered her options. She could fight and perhaps injure them enough to escape. That path risked killing men whose only crime was following orders. She could surrender and hope to convince the Inquisitor of her intentions. That path risked being deemed a demon host and executed without trial. She could attempt to run and risk being shot down. There was, she realized, a fourth option. During the destruction of the last portal, she had felt a tug, a resonance with a dimension she knew well. The space between spaces that she used to travel in her own universe. It was unstable here because of the warp, but it could be accessed briefly. It would take her away from Cadrivus, though she did not know where she would emerge. She projected this thought outward, not in words, but in a wave of images. Her leaving peacefully, the hive saved, the Imperium free to recover. She sensed flickers of understanding in the captain's mind, quickly snuffed out by duty. He lifted his bolter. He said a final command to stand down or face destruction. She nodded slightly, an acknowledgement of his position. She drew her cloak tighter and reached inward. Her soul gem flared. The space around her shimmered, the air vibrating as if heated. Shadows lengthened. The warp energies she had contained responded, aligning with her will. She traced a circle in the air with one hand, lines of dark energy forming. The Death Watch fired. Bolter rounds hurtled toward her. She pushed energy into the circle. A portal blossomed, not red like those the cult had summoned, but a swirling vortex of indigo and violet. She stepped toward it as the first round struck her shield. Pain flared along her arms where the kinetic force bled through. She gritted her teeth, focusing on the portal. It widened just enough for her to pass. She looked back at the captain. For a fraction of a second their eyes met, and she saw an emotion that surprised her. Respect. He saluted her with his sword, a small motion barely visible. In that gesture, she understood that he recognized her as a warrior, not a monster. She stepped into the portal. A rush of cold enveloped her. The world stretched and warped. She heard the roar of bolters cut off abruptly. She felt the pull of countless realities. She clung to her purpose like a lifeline. Behind her, the portal snapped shut, leaving the Death Watch facing empty air. Bolter rounds clanged off walls. The Marines lowered their weapons, the captain's shoulders sagging minutely. Raven was gone. The Inquisition would not have its prize. Whether that was a blessing or a curse, they could not say. Within the in-between space, Raven drifted. Colors shifted, voices whispered, the fabric of dimensions thin and translucent. She focused on the thread that led back to her home. It shimmered faintly. She reached for it. It pulled her like a current. She let herself be drawn, trusting that her journey had meaning. The section ended as she vanished into the color and sound, leaving behind a world that would remember her as a myth and carrying forward into the unknown with a resolve tempered by everything she had seen. Between realities, time did strange things. Moments stretched and compressed. As Raven was pulled along the shimmering thread toward her own dimension, echoes reached her from the world she left. The warp carries memories and emotions like driftwood on a tide. She glimpsed Inquisitor Caradoc standing in a command bunker, listening to the report from Brother Captain Thal. The words were delivered with precision. The unknown entity had intervened in multiple cult rituals, neutralized demonic incursions, eliminated a champion of Khorne, disrupted a high ritual, and then vanished through an unclassified portal. No civilian casualties were directly attributable to her actions. There was no evidence of her serving chaos. She could sense the Inquisitor's frown, his hesitation. His mind weighed the doctrine of suspicion against the evidence of deeds. She felt his decision when it came, cold and pragmatic. He declared the threat contained. Exterminatus was averted. The hive world would live, albeit scarred. He assigned teams to decontaminate the ritual sites, to purge any lingering cult activity, and to monitor for further anomalies. He ordered all records of the entity sealed, accessible only to members of the Ordo Malleus. He would not petition the High Lords for resources. The cost was too high to justify without immediate threat. The world had been saved, but his faith allowed no gratitude toward the unknown. Her presence remained a question mark in a universe that feared uncertainty. Raven also sensed the Death Watch kill team as they returned to their ship. They spoke little. Their body language suggested contemplation. She caught glimpses of their thoughts, curiosity about her origins, admiration for her skill, concern about the possibility of further rifts. They performed rites of purity over their armor and weapons, cleansing them of warp taint. They recited prayers to the Emperor, not of thanks but of fortitude. One of them, perhaps the one who saluted her, thought of a time long ago when he had fought beside a Xenos ally to defeat a greater threat. He wondered if the Emperor's will could sometimes be served by those outside the Imperium. He banished the thought quickly, fearful of its heretical implications. On Cadrivus, the survivors emerged from hiding. They took stock of their shattered world. Fires still burned. Blood stained the floors of the shrines. The psychers she had freed were rounded up by black-robed Adeptus Astra telepathica agents and led away in chains. Families searched for missing members. Some found only bodies. Others found hope in the fact that the sky above the hive did not tear open again. The Arbites re-established checkpoints. The Mechanicus began repairs on damaged infrastructure. Life, such as it was, continued. Raven felt their emotions, relief, sorrow, anger, numbness. No one knew the name of the woman in the dark cloak. Some whispered of an angel, others of a demon. Myths were already taking shape. As the echoes faded, Raven allowed herself to grieve briefly. She had saved a world, but could not stay to help rebuild it. She had prevented a demon from entering reality, but left behind people who would be judged harshly by their own rulers. The Imperium's cruelty was a wound she could not heal. She promised herself she would remember Custodes when making decisions in her own universe. The struggle against darkness was universal, but how one fought mattered. With that thought, she turned her attention to the thread guiding her home, focusing on the end of her journey. The section softened into a memory of voices fading, an image of a hive city bathed in the light of its star, and the quiet determination to continue her work across realities. When the swirling colors of the in-between space resolved, Raven found herself standing on a rooftop under a sky she recognized. It was night, and the stars were in the right places. The air smelled of salt and car exhaust, not promethium and blood. She was back in Jump City. The lights of the city glimmered below, and the noise of traffic washed over her. For a moment she stood still, letting the familiarity settle over her like a blanket. The weight of Custodes lifted slightly, though its memory remained. Behind her came a rush of wind. A figure landed lightly on the roof. She turned to see Robin, his mask reflecting the city lights, his posture half defensive, half relieved. He looked at her, taking in the state of her cloak, the soot on her face. He asked if she was all right, his words straightforward. Raven nodded. She could not explain everything yet. The voices of the Warhammer world lingered, and she needed time to process. Behind Robin, Starfire floated down, her hair glowing in the darkness, eyes wide with concern. Beast Boy arrived in the form of a hawk, shifting back to human as he landed. Cyborg's mechanized steps rang on the concrete. Her friends surrounded her, a circle of support. She let herself feel their emotions, relief, curiosity, fear for her, affection. She projected back reassurance, gratitude. She told them, without quotation marks, that she had faced something dark, but had returned. Robin accepted that answer for now, trusting her. Starfire enveloped her in a warm hug, her joy radiant. Raven allowed herself to smile slightly. Beast Boy made a joke about her cloak needing dry cleaning. Cyborg clapped her on the shoulder with a gentle clang and said he was glad she was safe. For a moment, the weight of the other universe receded, replaced by the warmth of her team. She turned toward the city and looked at the skyline. She thought of the hive spire on Custodes and the people who lived in its shadow. She thought of the Inquisitor who saved a world only to return to business as usual, and of the Death Watch captain who saluted a stranger. She thought of the cultists, victims of lies and hatred. She realized she felt both sorrow and hope. The Warhammer universe was grim, but even there she had found moments of compassion, the hesitant respect of a space marine, the gratitude of freed psychers. Even in the darkest places there were sparks of humanity. Raven spoke quietly, telling her friends a version of what had happened, a tear in reality, a world of endless war, cults that worshipped blood, soldiers who fought with zealous fervor, and how she had closed portals and saved lives. She omitted details that would cause nightmares. She emphasized the universality of the struggle against darkness. Robin listened intently, nodding. He saw parallels to their own battles. Starfire's eyes widened in sorrow. Beast Boy looked pale. Cyborg clenched his fists and said he wished he could have helped. They promised to be there if she needed to talk more later. She thanked them. This was the difference between her world and the Imperium. Here, she could lean on others without fear of condemnation. The section ended with her watching the first hints of dawn appear on the horizon, the night easing into light, a soft handoff from one challenge to the next. In the days that followed, Raven continued to carry the imprint of Custodes. She meditated in her room, candles flickering, incense burning. She replayed the events in her mind, not to dwell, but to learn. She considered the Imperium's scale, its harshness, its resilience. She recognized that compassion existed even within its machinery, but it was often buried under fear and doctrine. She pondered the Death Watch captain's salute, the Inquisitor's choice, the cultist's desperation, and the survivor's silence. Each memory was a thread in a tapestry of lessons. She opened ancient texts in the tower's library, searching for connections between her experience and myths recorded by others. She found stories of travelers who crossed into other realms, tales of heroes who fought gods and demons beyond their own worlds. She saw herself in those narratives, a link in a chain of wanderers who had touched many realities. She felt the enormity of the multiverse and her place in it. Her powers were a bridge, and with that came responsibility. Raven went to the roof at night and looked up at the stars. She spoke softly, not in prayer but in promise, to the memory of those on Cadrivus. She told them she would not forget. She vowed to continue fighting against darkness wherever it appeared. She would remember that victory meant more than destroying enemies. It meant protecting the innocent and seeking understanding even in the face of fanaticism. She would not allow the ease of cynicism to take root. She acknowledged that sometimes she would have to leave without closure, as she had on Cadrivus, but she would carry those unresolved stories with her as fuel. She also resolved to speak with her team about the importance of compassion in their own battles. The Titans fought many enemies who might one day be allies if circumstances changed. She would tell them about the Death Watch's hesitation and the Inquisitor's decisions. She would remind them that judgments could be tempered with mercy. The world they protected would be better for it. In her meditation, she confronted her father's voice again. Trigon mocked her promise, suggesting that her compassion was weakness. She responded by showing him the moment when the portal closed in the hive and the relief she felt when innocent lives were saved. She let him feel the warmth of Starfire's hug, the earnestness in Robin's voice, the camaraderie of her team. He recoiled. She smiled inwardly. Strength came from connection, not from domination. She would not be swayed by his taunts. As dawn painted the sky with soft colors, she ended her meditation. She felt calmer, her mind clear. She rose from her sitting position, extinguished the candles, and opened her window. Fresh air flowed in. She inhaled deeply. The scent was different from that of the hive, cleaner, lighter, but she detected a hint of ozone that reminded her of the reactors. She would not forget. She stepped back from the window, closed it, and went to join her team in the kitchen. Beast Boy was making pancakes. Starfire was humming. Robin was reading reports. Cyborg was adjusting a circuit board while music played. Normalcy reasserted itself, and she embraced it, knowing that the next call might take her somewhere just as dark as Cadrivus. The section ended with her picking up a plate, the simple act of sharing breakfast carrying the weight of her oath forward. Back in her world, Raven occasionally tuned her senses to the warp, not to draw power, but to listen. The fabric between realities held whispers of distant decisions that would affect countless lives. In quiet moments, she felt the ripple of Inquisitor Caradoc's report as it reached higher authorities. The High Lords of Terra were mythical in their own right, rulers of a distant throne world she had only glimpsed through fragments of memory. Through the warp's echo, she heard their voices, a chorus of age and authority. The words were indistinct, like listening through water, but the tone was clear. Skepticism, caution, politics. They questioned Caradoc about his decision not to use exterminatus. He explained his reasoning with cold logic, citing the destruction of the cults and the containment of the threat. He reported on the unknown entity, describing her actions without embellishment. Some lords murmured about potential allies, others about new dangers. They instructed him to seal his report, to file it under restricted classifications. They debated whether to pursue research into portals that did not rely on warp corruption. They weighed resource allocations and the risks of curiosity. In the end, caution prevailed. Investigation would proceed quietly without public acknowledgement. Life in the Imperium would continue unchanged on the surface. Raven wondered what it meant that her presence had reached such a high level of government in another reality. She was a single soul among trillions, yet her actions had influenced policy. The thought both humbled and disquieted her. She considered the responsibility that came with power, the fact that even small decisions could ripple outward. She recalled her mentors telling her that every action had consequences beyond her perception. She resolved to remain mindful of that truth. At night, she dreamed of the chamber of the High Lords. In her dream, the room was vast, with tall pillars and a ceiling lost in darkness. Seats arranged in a semicircle held shadowy figures, their features indistinct. The floor was polished stone that reflected light like still water. Caradoc stood below them, dwarfed by their presence, yet unbowed. Raven watched from above, unseen. She felt the dryness in the air, smelled incense and old parchment. Voices echoed. She saw a glint of something at the edge of her vision, a golden throne far beyond, hidden behind curtains of power. She woke before the dream resolved. She sat upright, heart beating fast. She wondered if the dream was a residue of her warp journey or a message. She decided it didn't matter. It served as a reminder that decisions were made by people, no matter how lofty their titles, and that change was possible even within ossified systems. She spent time researching ways to shield her mind from future echoes. Constant exposure to other realities' emotions and decisions could become overwhelming. She practiced exercises to tune out the warp's background hum, focusing on her own reality. When she chose to listen, she did so with purpose. When she chose silence, she honored her own boundaries. The echoes of the High Lords faded into the background, joining the myriad voices of the multiverse. The section ended with her placing a ward on her soul gem, a small gesture of self-care, and stepping into the sunlight to join her friends. The weight of cosmic politics tempered by the immediate warmth of camaraderie. As weeks turned to months, Raven occasionally reached out to the warp to check on the world of Cadrivus. Distance meant little to psychic impressions. She sensed the planet like a faint star in the darkness, its emotions a blend of pain and perseverance. She listened and felt the birth of a story. In the lower hives, people whispered of a shadowed angel who descended from a tear in the sky, closed the mouths of hungry gods, and vanished before the Emperor's soldiers could cage her. They called her the Raven of the Underhive. Some added details that weren't true, a halo of purple fire, wings that spanned the hive, a voice that commanded storms. Others insisted she was a demon seeking skulls, and that it was only the Emperor's mercy that drove her away. Raven smiled softly at the exaggerations. Myth had always been shaped by those who told it, molded to fit cultural needs. In the Imperium, where hope was rationed, the idea of a savior from another reality could be both comforting and dangerous. She felt the Inquisition quietly suppressing tales they deemed too inspiring, allowing only narratives that reinforced fear or obedience. Still, stories spread like smoke. A child in a worker's hab carved a raven into the wall and whispered a prayer to it when her father left for the mines. An old woman lit a candle below a broken pipeline and thanked the shadow for sparing her son during the purge. A gang leader tattooed a raven on his arm, claiming protection. Raven felt these small acts resonate. She also felt the Inquisitors' irritation, their efforts to quash unauthorized worship, their confusion about how to classify an entity that did not fit their categories. She considered intervening, to correct misunderstandings or to encourage hope. She decided against direct interference. The people of Cadrivus needed to forge their own stories. She had done what she could. It was not her place to become a god to them. She could, however, send a whisper. During a meditative trance, She focused on the planet and projected a simple feeling: courage without fanaticism. She hoped it would reach receptive minds. She imagined the child feeling warmth when she traced the raven. She imagined the old woman smiling. She let the wave dissipate. Back in Jump City, she walked through the park with Beast Boy. He turned into various animals to amuse passing children. She laughed lightly when he tripped over his own tail as a dog. She realized that humor was as important a weapon against darkness as any spell. She told him a toned-down version of the stories emerging from Cadrivus. He raised his eyebrows and suggested she start charging royalties. She rolled her eyes. They sat on a bench, and she watched a flock of real ravens circling overhead. Their calls were harsh but alive. She wondered if any of her namesake species existed in the Imperium. She hoped somewhere a bird flew free above the endless hives. The section closed on that image, a raven against a polluted sky, wings beating steadily, carrying with it a story that would outlast those who tried to silence it. On a quiet evening, Raven sat cross-legged on the floor of the tower's meditation room. Candles flickered in a circle around her. The air was cool, the sound of the ocean outside a gentle murmur. She focused on her breathing, letting the rhythm carry her deeper into herself. She saw the multiverse as a web, threads connecting countless realities. Each thread represented a world like Cadrivus or Earth, with its own stories, struggles, and heroes. Some threads were bright, others dim, some frayed. She saw herself moving along these threads, drawn where she was needed. She understood that her journey would never truly end. There would always be portals to close, demons to confront, and people to help. She accepted that eternal task not with resignation, but with purpose. Compassion did not diminish with distance. Empathy was not limited to one universe. Her heart was a vessel that could expand to hold the sorrows and joys of many worlds. At the same time, she acknowledged her limits. She could not save everyone. Sometimes she would arrive too late. Sometimes she would have to leave before she could finish healing the wounds. Sometimes her actions would be misunderstood. These truths could have hardened her, but she allowed them to keep her humble. The key was to try, to act with kindness where possible, and with firmness where necessary. Her mind drifted to the people she had met in the Warhammer universe. The Psychers she freed, the mutated child, the stoic Captain Thal, the relentless Inquisitor, the nameless cultists who sought meaning in blood. Each life had value, even those lost to madness. She held them for a moment in her mind, then let them go. She thought of her team, their support anchoring her. She realized that the unity she shared with the Titans was what the Imperium lacked. Fear divided them, suspicion paralyzed them. She wondered if, in some distant future, beings like her could help bridge that divide. For now, the best she could do was be an example. She opened her eyes. The candles burned lower. She stood and blew them out one by one. Darkness settled gently. She felt no fear. The darkness was part of her, but she controlled it. She left the room and walked through the tower. The hallway lights cast warm pools of illumination. She passed a window and glanced outside. The moon hung high, its light silver on the waves. She smiled. There was beauty in her world that did not exist in the Grimdark of Warhammer. That beauty was worth defending. That was why she fought. Down in the common room, she found her friends arguing playfully over a board game. Beast Boy accused Cyborg of cheating. Starfire tried to understand the rules. Robin shook his head, amused. They looked up as she entered. They made space for her. She sat down, feeling the simple pleasure of companionship. As she picked up a game piece, she thought about the endless war in another universe and the eternal compassion she would carry into it. The scene faded into laughter and the rolling of dice, a soft, emotional handoff from reflections on cosmic duty to the warmth of shared human moments. Her journey would continue, but for now she was exactly where she needed to be. If you hunger for more tales of impossible encounters in the dark millennium, smash that subscribe button. And the Emperor protects those who support the channel.